Hello and welcome back to today's episode of TSARP. I'm your host, Andrew Weir, and today our co host is Sam.
Hello.
So, today we got a very special guest. His name's Ben Kohlmann. You might have seen him on Twitter. He is the Defense Innovation Leader at the U.S. Navy. He's also a venture capitalist at Qubit Capital. And yeah, so you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Andrew and Sam, thanks for having me on. Right now I'm in the private sector, working in venture capital, primarily focused on national security, early stage startups, industrial startups, and energy startups. And I'm still a Navy reservist. I do a little bit of work here and there in innovation work, but spent a large part of my military career flying F-18s and then building the early infrastructure to link up the Defense Department with Silicon Valley about 10 or 12 years ago.
That's amazing. So, when did you decide you wanted to go into the military? When you were a kid, a little bit older?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated with airplanes. My grandfather was a World War II pilot. He flew off the USS Wasp and USS Hornet flying Corsairs. And my great uncle, he was a pilot from World War II through the end of the Vietnam era. But where that story really takes off is he was shot down over Vietnam and spent 5 years in a prisoner of war camp called the Hanoi Hilton, which was a pretty brutal place to be. Guys like former Senator John McCain and Vice Admiral Jim Stockdale, who at one point was a vice presidential candidate with Ross Perot back in 1992. They were cellmates of his in 1968 to 1973. And the stories of those two folks, my grandfather and Uncle David, were pretty formative to how I grew up. I also loved the movie Midway, mid 1970s flick about the famous battle there, and always wanted to be a military pilot. And so throughout high school and college, that was my main focus, and was fortunate to get a commission in the Navy and go to flight school.
That's awesome. For anyone that wants to get into the military and start on a career path like that, do you have any tips? Anything you did?
I think the best folks who join our volunteer service really have a deep passion for it. It's a hard life. It's not easy by any means, but what makes it worth it is kind of a drive inside an individual to want to make a difference and to want to do that role and job. At the same time, a lot of folks get in for 2, 3, 4 years, just want to listen and serve their country, and transition out. And there are a lot of great reasons to join. I think kind of know what you want to get out of it, know the specific either career path or kind of the goals by the end of it, just to make that time a little bit more worthwhile. And then obviously focus on physical fitness and the other things, but really gird yourself for the reality of military life, which is a great life of service, but there are some trade-offs you're making with other opportunities in service of our country.
Gotcha. All right. And then when did you decide what specifically you wanted to do? Was it, you said you had a love for planes, and then is that what made you decide to become a pilot?
Yeah, the way that it works is at some point, at least in the officer track with ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, which is the program I went through, and the Naval Academy, which is a parallel commissioning path. They basically stack rank you, and you get there's a certain number of slots for pilots, a certain number of slots for submariners, a certain number of slots for surface warfare guys. And then if you want to be an aviator, you have to do a battery of tests, including medical screening and then some spatial perception, I guess, testing. Then based on how your scores pan out in all those areas, you apply to be a pilot, and they give you a pilot slot. And if that doesn't work out, then you can transition to be a submariner, which has its own kind of science-based track. And then a lot of other folks end up just being a surface warfare officer. And there are a couple of trade-offs there. I mean, aviators tend to have a longer service commitment. I spent 11 years of active duty, because once I got my wings after about 2 years of training, I had an 8-year commitment and extended that a little bit. Other service segments are less commitment, anywhere from 4 to 5 years, which give people an off ramp if they want to go do something else with their lives. But yeah, I always wanted to fly and was fortunate to get a slot, and then went to flight school down in Pensacola.
All right. And after that, how did you decide you wanted to go into the innovation space?
So when I was a senior in college, we had to take a course as a first class midshipman called Leadership and Ethics. And the commanding officer of our ROTC unit had just come from building the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, which was a very early innovation organization to rethink how the Marines in particular were thinking about warfare. And he had a very unconventional approach to the class. He basically took the specifically assigned Naval Academy reader and set that aside and built his own curriculum, which leveraged a number of very forward-leaning military philosophers and officers. And that was my first exposure to the fact that, being a good military officer isn't just about exclusively following the orders of your superiors. It's more important to hold true to your oath to the Constitution, and in service to our country, ask hard questions sometimes. And so for the first 7 to 8 years of my military career, I was in the lower ranks and was in a position where I really needed to follow orders, and that was the right thing to do. But I was always observing and orienting what was happening around me. And during that time, I got sent to Afghanistan and flew 32 combat missions over there, but became pretty disillusioned with the way that we were fighting that war. And while we were tracking metrics in terms of the number of stories we were flying and the number of bombs we dropped and the effectiveness we had in saving American lives, at the end of the day, I wasn't seeing much progress on the ground. And in parallel, I had peers who had gone to Silicon Valley and were taking part in world-changing companies like at the time Facebook and Airbnb and Twitter. And I couldn't help but think like there's got to be some lessons learned from this innovation economy that we could apply to the military context and hopefully allow us to fight our nation's wars better, to defeat very capable adversaries, but in new and unique ways. And seeing things up close in the military and then seeing what my peers were doing, I saw an opportunity to really push the envelope within the military for how we were thinking about procurement. And the current moment, there's a strong tailwinds for defense tech, for new ideas, for new entrants. But when we were thinking about this 12 years ago, nobody wanted it. Silicon Valley certainly wasn't paying attention to defense tech. The DoD itself was beholden to the five main prime contractors. They had no interest or desire to kind of go out to the same processes. So a couple of us just stood up and started writing somewhat intemperate articles, but pushing the admirals and senior civilian leaders to think differently about it, and it kind of catalyzed the whole movement.
Oh, okay. And then is that when you founded the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum?
It was, yes. There were two organizations that we built in parallel. One was an official entity within the Navy, and the second was a nonprofit that was more of a community organizing effort. The CNO Rapid Innovation Cell was actually started by the Chief of Naval Operations, and that's where the CNO acronym comes from. The Chief of Naval Operations is basically the CEO of the Navy. He's a four-star admiral, he or she, in this case, the current CNO, but they're based out of DC, and they set a lot of the strategy and policy. And Admiral Greenert, who was a submariner, really had a keen interest in uncovering new technologies and wanted to experiment by giving young junior officers a chance to push new technologies on the fleet. And so we got to put 3D printers on ships for the first time, and we kind of rewrote the whole Navy cyber strategy and had some thoughts on personnel reform. And like those were very tangible outcomes. But what really catalyzed the movement was relational networks. And this is where the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum came in, where this was multi-service. It crossed uniform and civilian lines and incorporated entrepreneurs who are not in the military in a TEDx startup weekend type experience. And we gave the floor to junior officers, to young people with big ideas, and let them have 15 to 20-minute keynotes. We had a lot of ideation sessions together to figure out, hey, how could we use social media? How could we use technology from the private sector in our military roles? And those two entities kind of running in parallel created the foundation for a very strong innovation network that very quickly spread throughout the Defense Department and set the basis for a lot of the organizations that have endured to this day, like Defense Innovation Unit, Hacking for Defense, and other efforts that are continue to drive the innovation message forward.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that interesting. We work a lot. I was saying this before the show with a lot of nonprofits, and I love to see what they're all doing and what their missions are because it's just fascinating to me. And then after that, what did you move on to after the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum?
So I took one last role in the military. I worked for a four-star admiral on the on the East Coast. I was a speechwriter and aide, and then transitioned to business school. Went out west to Stanford to kind of finalize my education. Spent some time in consulting down here in Dallas. Then ran a startup for about a year. Ultimately, we had to wind that down. Couldn't find the market traction that we wanted, and the capital we had wasn't sufficient to get us where we needed to go. And then took over running venture capital for Cubic Capital, running the national security arm of venture capital for Cubic Capital about a year ago.
Yeah, so what made you want to go into venture capital?
I've always been, I've always had an investor's mindset. When I was, young and even in college, dabbled in the stock market and looking at businesses. Have a real estate portfolio, and I've always just been deeply curious about the world and understanding kind of the major trends that are emerging. What was interesting is when I was at business school, I went to one of the counselors and asked him, okay, military, and I'd love to be an investor at some point. Like, can you help me like figure out what the pathway should be? And he's like, Ben, you'll never be an investor. You're an operating guy. Like, it's not even worth your time or effort. So being the good soldier that I still was, I kind of, hung my head like, yeah, you're probably right. So, did the operating side of things, but always had this like deep desire to explore that space. And after Farcast wound down about a year and a half ago now at this point, I just kind of opened up the aperture and kind of waited for the right opportunity. And, whether it was Providence or something else, this opportunity came out with a local organization, and they were looking to build out a venture capital firm. They were looking for somebody who understood Silicon Valley. I think the military background certainly helped from their American exceptionalism viewpoint, and it was a great match. And we've been doing great work for a year, but I really fell backwards into it. It was a little bit of patience, a little bit of timing, a little bit of luck, but I was fortunate to find the Qubit team when I did, and it's been off to the races ever since.
Yeah, and like I said, for joining the military, do you have any tips for anyone trying to get into venture capital?
Um, it's it's hard to break into it. There is a traditional golden path, which and there's almost two of them. One is, do the finance route and, get the finance experience with an investment bank, likely in tech, and then recruit for a venture firm. The second is join a very fast growing startup and make it to the executive ranks or start your own company and have a successful outcome. And, there's usually pathways into venture from there. Um, but the more traditional paths are kind of timing based and relational based. And I think the most important tip I can have is never underestimate the relational networks you're developing right now. Not because they should be transactional, but because you never know how they're going to pay off later. And the earlier you start, the more compounding has to take effect, and someone in your network will likely know an opportunity when it emerges that might be the right fit. And the last thing I'll say is, if you really want something, like, do whatever it takes to go after it. I mean, within moral and ethical bounds, of course. But like, there are ways to set yourself up for success. Similar to what you did, Andrew. Like, you just email and DM people directly, and I don't know what your hit rate is, but I'm sure it's better than zero because you clearly have a daily podcast with really exceptional guests. Sometimes you just got to put the work in untraditional ways, and I think persistence and focus and determination actually has a very high chance of success if you just stick with it long enough.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like I will message people I just find interesting, people I've seen that I think would be great on the podcast. I mean, that's a great example of just, like trying to, um, you know, accomplish your goals in different ways, or just, coming up with a way or a plan and just like attacking at that plan. But I think, like, I have a lot of examples in my like year and a half of like try like on a big project like this podcast of exactly what you were saying. um but I think I've talked about that in other episodes, but I think everything you said was very true. And
Hmm.
if you have something you just want to accomplish, try your hardest to accomplish it, and like you said, in ethical and moral make sure you don't go
Mhm.
outside those boundaries.
Right.
Yeah.
Sam, you had a question, right?
Yeah. So, what is your favorite part of venture capital and everything?
I'm sorry, say that question again.
What's your favorite part of venture capital?
I love meeting and talking with founders. Um, Yesterday, we went down to Austin and visited the factory of a very early stage defense startup. And it was great just to be in that very raw environment. It's almost an unkempt warehouse with a bunch of old machine presses and manufacturing equipment with a couple of young guys and some computers, and they're just building things. And then sitting around the table for an hour, hour and a half, getting to know them, talking through their strategic views, what the problems they're solving, their unique approaches. Uh, I always leave those conversations, whether or not we invest or whatever, just deeply optimistic about the future of America, the future of young people, and all the untapped potential that we have. And I love being able to help people, drive toward their dreams. And many of those dreams require capital infusion. And so being able to give them dollars to go build something for America, that's just super inspiring.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean that's really like, the one of the missions of TSARP is to, inspire young entrepreneurs by having guests like yourself on the podcast and talk about your journey, or whether it's talking about the current news and the amazing things some companies are doing out there. But I think it's a very, very important thing because there we all the great CEOs and billionaires and innovators and remarkable people out there all started young, right? Or they all, were kids once, and if they had an inspirational source or a place to really start off easier, think about even more that they could have done or will do in the future. But
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah, so I know that I know that the defense tech space is very difficult a lot for startups to break into. How do you go about like helping the startups you invest in break into that space more?
Well, we tend to invest in startups that kind of have a unique insight into the defense tech space, kind of in two areas. One is they've got their go-to-market function nearly, if not completely wired. And that is very different in the defense and government sector than it is in the commercial sector. And so we'll look at how deep their relationships are with the right people on the Hill in Congress, what the points of contact they have in the Department of Defense, both in the uniform military side, and then what combat validation they have for their particular solution. And if this is actually solving a burning platform problem for their customer, and if the solution kind of seamlessly or nearly seamlessly integrates with the existing way that these military personnel are integrating into their battle operations. Um, and the second part really doubles down on that part is, does this person really understand the problem set? Do they understand the strategic and tactical requirements of modern warfare? And can they build the product to the specs that the end customers will want and need? And I think there's still a number of very well-regarded startups who have raised a lot of money that have a great technological concept, but haven't quite cracked the code on validating it with the end user customer. And what's unique about the Defense Department is the best technology doesn't always win. It comes down to relational capital. It comes down to, can you manage the contract process? Can you build a solution that meets the other solutions that are already being used by these service members? And you can't just come in and wedge this like brand new widget that does all these whiz bang things and expect that to be a standalone product. All this stuff is in an integrated whole that has to work together.
And we're in a very innovative time right now. A lot of things are happening. A lot of new companies coming about that are just doing amazing things. What do you see in the future of? We can start with defense tech, and then just in general with technology.
I mean, I think defense tech will continue to be important. I This year I have been a little more cautious in terms of the number of investments and the pricing that defense tech companies are at. I love the rush of capital in the space. I love the number of founders who want to build meaningful things for our society. And there's going to be a limited number of those that will actually find long-term traction, because as much as we have the Defense Department right now, I think the Defense Department is still pretty tepid towards the startup community because they don't know it that well. I mean, I'll give you an example. My brother is a commander in the Navy in '05. He recently got assigned to the Pentagon, and he came home for Christmas. And I asked him, Matt, what's the word about the Pentagon about Anduril? And Anduril, many of your listeners may know, is a kind of one of the premier defense tech companies. And he paused and he said, "Is Anduril the sword from the Lord of the Rings?" And like, even my brother, who's been living with, we've talked for 10, 12 years about this innovation stuff, he didn't know what Anduril was. And so there are these unique ecosystems that all of us play in, where we understand like what the shibboleths are and what the companies are. But even well-attuned service members are focused on their day-to-day. They're unaware of the defense innovation stuff happening. And so I say that as a cautionary tale about, like, as much as a startup in defense might think they have traction, they probably don't have much like mind share penetration, which in the end of the day is what drives the big contracts down the line. So I love the enthusiasm, but we'll see where it actually plays out. Other sectors I'm looking at that I think are going to emerge is energy. I think AI is going to drive huge demand for energy, and we need to have a lot more clean, abundant energy available to us to deploy to support these data centers. We've been looking more heavily at small nuclear reactors and other things. Now, there are some significant cost challenges with those, even if the tech is relatively proven out. But markets tend to open up opportunities, and there is going to be a huge crunch for energy. We're going to have something break through to provide this energy. And I think more energy is good for humanity. You look at the correlation between GDP and flourishing and welfare and the amount of energy consumed, and they're almost a 1-to-1 ratio. So more energy leads to better outcomes for humans. And I think that's why I'm really interested in energy, but we actually have to generate it from somewhere and do it in a sustainable way. And I think nuclear and a lot of other things that are coming out could be that pathway. So I'm looking closely at that, even if we haven't made any formal investment. Like, I see that on the horizon as a critical unlock for the next phase of humanity.
And would you invest in a company like that outside of your defense tech sector?
Yeah, so we've done industrials, so kind of 21st century manufacturing. We've done a couple rare earth and energy related plays, and then we've done other things in education and healthcare and areas that kind of are undergird our broader human flourishing thesis. So we have a relatively wide remit, even if I spend a lot of my time in the defense tech space.
Gotcha. All right. And what do you see, like, with new technologies emerging, working their way into defense tech? Like, do you see AI in defense tech? I mean, there already is really a lot, but how do you see that evolving?
I think AI is going to impact the world in a very deep way. I think, autonomy is in the future, but where I see AI really making a difference is helping human decision makers make faster and better decisions. Whether it's through logistics or targeting or tracking. If AI can go in and sort through all this data we have, and then based on what battlefield commanders or others want to optimize for, provide highest probability solutions with an assessment of what the possible consequential branches are, even presenting that to a battlefield commander is like, hey, if you want to do this, here's 3 things you can do right now, given what we know the enemy's layout is and how many weapons we have, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the commander can pick one of those 3 things, given their judgment and the intuition they have. Like, that actually increases the speed of execution and allows human operators to focus on the most important things and do what they do best. So this like human machine teaming, I think, is where some real magic occurs. At some point in the future, I'm sure AI, I don't know if it's 1 year or 100 years, AI is going to have the ability for true creativity and in a human-like way. But right now, it can actually augment and help the humans to really drive those creative solutions where we have a distinct advantage right now.
Yeah, and like you said, we really have no idea when, like, how fast it's going to advance. Like you said, like in a year or 100 years, no one can put a date or a time frame where they think this stuff is going to happen. Like, it could be tomorrow when you're now thinking like, oh, we have this huge new technology that just came across my desk. What are we going to invest? How is that going to affect? Or it could be, 5 years when it's like that big new thing that really gets invented. But yeah, I think that's one of the things I love about technology is that you just never know when things are going to happen and how quickly things are going to change. And normally it's pretty fast, which is again
Yeah.
why I like it. What do you see as the future of your career or something you want to move into? Is there any project in your mind you want to work on or anything like that?
I mean, I'm very happy with what I'm doing right now. You know, some people ask the question, if you had $1 billion right now, how would you spend your time? I think I can authentically say I'd probably keep doing what I'm doing right now. I'd invest and build and find the next great generation of founders and help them do that. So from that standpoint, like I feel like I've won the lottery. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I think continuing to explore the world around us, and I think one of the great parts about this job is if we're interested in a segment, like we can go super deep. Like I mentioned, nuclear. The past month, even if we may not invest in the near term in nuclear, I've been able to go to events and meet with folks and talk to founders in the space and kind of really tear apart the industry. And I think I have a far deeper understanding of the pros and cons of that particular technology. And it's not driven from like, hey, I have to get an A in my paper. It's driven from like, man, this is really interesting. And I can explore the passions because they align well with how we want to invest in the world. And all the knowledge accrued there is accretive to the objective of us investing in the best companies moving forward. And so I love the intellectual challenge of this and trying to wrestle through a bunch of ambiguous information to try to make sense of it. And, I don't think we'll be able to predict the future, but at least kind of sense where the waves are going.
All right. And what do you think you would ever be a founder again, or a CEO instead of the venture capital route? Like, I know you said you really like what you're doing, but could you see that in the future?
Possibly. I mean, never want to close off any opportunity. I mean, having run a company before and having built a number of nonprofit organizations from the ground up, I clearly have the entrepreneurial bug. Now, I don't know what that looks like and on what time horizon. And as I mentioned, I'm very happy where I'm at right now and love coming to work every day. So who knows what the future holds? I mean, there's a whole bunch of different pathways, a lot of different things that go through my mind. And one of the unique things about venture is I see all the problems people are trying to solve. And that just cascades into recognizing other problems that could be solved. And, there could come a point where I'm like, you know what, this is the thing that I think the world needs. And I'm in a unique position to do it. And let's do it. But that moment has not yet come, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's great that you have that joy in what you do, and I think that's really what everyone strives for, right? Like loving to go to work and do what they do, and I'm glad you have that. Thank you for coming today. I mean, you've shared a lot that has been fascinating. You really have inspired me in what I'm doing in my future career, and just given me a lot of info, and I think you have to our viewers too. We'll take a lot from this. But yeah, unless Sam or do you have any final questions, or Ben, anything you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I think I'm good. This has been amazing.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to both of you for reaching out and glad we had the conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you today's Friday, so we'll see you back here on Monday. And yeah, bye bye.
Bye,
Sure.
everyone.